April 18, 1944. The skies over Recklinlerz airfield, Germany. A soft morning haze drifted across the tarmac as Hauptmann Werner Schröer adjusted his flight goggles, convinced that analyzing this captured American fighter was merely a formality. The Reich's engineers had assured him that German aviation technology remained superior in every meaningful aspect. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Schröer and his colleagues would discover over the coming weeks would fundamentally alter their understanding of the air war and reveal an industrial gap that no amount of German engineering genius or pilot skill could overcome. Hauptmann Schröer stood motionless on the runway, studying the sleek aluminum form of the North American P-51 Mustang that sat before him. Serial number 43-6581, this particular aircraft had been captured relatively intact after its American pilot, Second Lieutenant James Hargreaves of the 357th Fighter Group, had been forced to make an emergency landing behind German lines near Münster 2 months prior. The aircraft bore the scars of its final flight, bullet holes patched with mismatched aluminum panels and the vibrant red tail partially repainted in Luftwaffe markings. Yet even with these modifications, it remained unmistakably American, a foreign predator now caged for German inspection. "So this is the aircraft that's been giving our boys so much trouble," said Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Meyer, approaching from behind. Meyer was shorter than Schröer, with piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. As one of the Luftwaffe's foremost test pilots at the Rechlin Test Center, he had flown nearly every aircraft in the European theater, Allied and Axis alike. "It doesn't look particularly impressive," Schröer replied, walking slowly around the fighter. "The cockpit sits too high, poor visibility downward during dogfights." "Perhaps," Meyer said, but Galland insisted this evaluation be given top priority. He's been demanding more fighter production and fewer bombers for months. Apparently Reich Marshal Goering accused him of defeatism. Schröer nodded grimly. The tension between Fighter General Adolf Galland and Goering had become legendary within Luftwaffe circles. Galland's increasingly desperate requests for more fighters revealed the strain the Luftwaffe was under, though few would admit it openly. "Well, let's see what the Americans have built that's so special," Schröer said, patting the Mustang's fuselage. "I'll take her up tomorrow morning, weather permitting." Across the field inside the main hangar of the test facility, Engineer Dr. Ludwig Bölkow hunched over a disassembled Packard V-12 engine, the American-built version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the captured Mustang. At 42 years old, Bölkow was considered one of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. His thinning hair and perpetual stoop gave him the appearance of a much older man, though his mind remained razor-sharp. "Look at the simplicity of this design," Bölkow muttered to his assistant, Faber. "American industrial efficiency at its finest. Fewer parts than our Daimler-Benz, easier to manufacture and maintain." Faber, a young engineer with round spectacles that magnified his already wide eyes, nodded eagerly. "The supercharger is impressive as well, Herr Doctor. 2-stage operation for high-altitude performance," Bölkow grunted. "Yes, and that's precisely what makes this aircraft so dangerous. Our pilots report that the Mustangs seem to fly just as well at 8,000 meters as they do at 3,000. Our own fighters lose significant performance above 6,000. "But surely our Bf-109G models can match it?" Faber asked, the earnestness in his voice betraying his youth. Bölkow looked up from the engine, fixing Faber with a stern gaze. "That remains to be seen. That's why we're conducting these tests." He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "What concerns me more is what this engine represents." "Sir? This is an American-built version of a British design. Do you understand what that means? The Americans took the British Merlin, adapted it for mass production, and are now building them by the thousands. Their industrial capacity—" Bölkow trailed off, shaking his head. "Gather the performance data from the test flights. I want to compare thrust-to-weight ratios with our latest models." The following morning dawned clear and cold, ideal flying conditions. A small crowd of mechanics, engineers, and fellow test pilots gathered to watch as Werner Schröer prepared for the first German evaluation flight of the captured Mustang. He had spent the previous evening studying the American pilot's manual. translated hastily into German. The cockpit layout was different from the Messerschmitt fighters he was accustomed to, but the principles remained the same. As the ground crew finished their pre-flight checks, Oberstleutnant Hans Sander approached. As commander of the Rechlin Test Center, Sander's presence underscored the importance of these evaluations. "Remember, Schröer," Sander said, his voice low and serious, "we need objective assessments, not patriotic ones." Schröer nodded. "Of course, Herr Oberstleutnant. I'll put her through every maneuver in our standard test protocol." "Good. And Schröer, be careful with that machine. It's more valuable to us intact than as another wreck." 10 minutes later, Schröer sat in the Mustang's cockpit, familiarizing himself with the controls. The instrument panel was logically arranged, though different from German designs. Everything was larger, more robust, with greater spacing between controls, designed for ease of manufacturing and maintenance rather than for precision engineering elegance. The Packard V12 engine roared to life with a distinctive rumble that differed from the high-pitched scream of German power plants. Schröer taxied to the runway, applied full throttle, and was surprised by the immediate response. The Mustang accelerated with astonishing eagerness, lifting off after a remarkably short takeoff roll. As he climbed through 3,000 meters, Schröer began his evaluation. First, basic maneuverability tests, banking turns, rolls, and loops. The Mustang responded crisply, though not quite as nimbly as his Bf-109 at these altitudes. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent forward and to the sides, less so to the rear and below, confirming his earlier observation. But it was when he pushed the aircraft above 6,000 meters that Schröer experienced the first shock. While German fighters tended to lose responsiveness at high altitudes, the Mustang seemed to come alive. The two-stage supercharged engine maintained power where the Daimler-Benz engines began to strain. At 8,000 meters, he executed a series of combat maneuvers and found the aircraft responded with nearly the same authority as at lower altitudes. "Mein Gott," he muttered to himself, checking his oxygen mask seal reflexively. The implications were immediately clear. This was why the Americans could escort their bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany, maintaining combat effectiveness where Luftwaffe interceptors struggled. After 90 minutes of intensive testing, Schröer returned to Rechlin. As he taxied back to the hard stand, he was already mentally composing his report. The maintenance crew swarmed the aircraft as he climbed out, eager to check systems and refuel for the afternoon's test flights. "Well," Meyer asked as Schröer removed his flight helmet. "It's good," Schröer admitted reluctantly. "Very good at high altitude. The range is impressive, too. I barely used a quarter of the fuel, and I wasn't even flying economically." Meyer's expression darkened. "That confirms what our pilots at the front have been reporting. The Americans escort their bombers all the way to the target and still have enough fuel to hunt our fighters. The Bf-109 can still outmaneuver it below 5,000 meters, Schröer added, and our cannon armament is superior to their machine guns. A good German pilot in a 109 can still defeat a Mustang." "But for how long?" Meyer asked quietly. "And against how many?" That evening, the test pilots and engineers gathered in the officers' mess to discuss the day's findings. The room buzzed with conversation as data was compared and experiences shared. Belkow had set up a small projection screen to display comparative performance charts, the stark lines and numbers telling a story that many were reluctant to fully acknowledge. "Gentlemen," Sander called the room to attention. "Today's tests have provided valuable information. Hauptmann Schröer, please summarize your findings for those who haven't read your preliminary report." Schröer stood, aware that his words would likely travel beyond this room, perhaps even to Berlin. He chose them carefully. The P-51 Mustang represents a significant achievement in fighter design. Its performance at high altitude exceeds our current frontline fighters, and its range is approximately double that of our Bf-109. The cockpit ergonomics are excellent, and the aircraft is stable as a gun platform. He paused, noting the grim expressions around the room. However, our aircraft retains several advantages. The Mustang's turning radius is larger than our fighters at medium and low altitudes. Our cannon armament delivers greater destructive power than their multiple 50-caliber machine guns, and our aircraft are still more responsive in vertical maneuvers at speeds below 400 kilometers per hour. Sander nodded. Thank you, Hauptmann. Dr. Belkov, what can you tell us about the technical aspects? Belkov stood, adjusting his glasses. The Packard engine is a marvel of mass production. It has fewer machined surfaces than our engines, greater tolerance allowances in the specifications, and yet delivers exceptional performance. The airframe itself shows similar characteristics. The wing spars are simple extrusions rather than complex forgings. The Americans have designed this aircraft to be built quickly by moderately skilled workers. Are you suggesting it's inferior? Asked one of the junior officers. Not at all, Belkov replied sharply. I'm pointing out that while we're building sports cars by hand, they're building good, reliable family automobiles on assembly lines, and they're building thousands of them. A heavy silence fell over the room. The intelligence reports suggest the Americans are producing over 800 fighters per month, Sander added quietly, across all types. Our monthly production for all fighters currently stands at approximately 500, and that's before accounting for bombing disruptions. Oberleutnant Weber, who had flown the Mustang in the afternoon tests, spoke up. The Americans have solved the escort fighter problem we couldn't. Remember, the Bf-110 was supposed to escort our bombers over England, but it failed because it lacked the performance to defend itself against single-engine fighters. Schröer nodded. The Mustang can fight and win against single-engine fighters at the bomber stream's altitude. That changes everything. As the technical discussion continued, Unteroffizier Dieter Lehmann sat quietly at the back of the room. At 23, he was the youngest pilot present, having been transferred to test duties after sustaining injuries during combat over Italy. His left arm still bore the scars of a crash landing after his Focke-Wulf 190 was damaged by American fighters. You're unusually quiet, Lehmann, Meyer said, noticing the young pilot's thoughtful expression. I was just remembering something, Herr Oberleutnant. Last November, before my squadron was transferred from Sicily, we intercepted a formation of B-17 bombers. No fighter escort. They couldn't reach us that far south at the time. We shot down 3 for the loss of one of our aircraft. Lehmann's voice grew softer. 2 months later, after my transfer to the Eastern Front, I heard the same bomber group returned, but this time with Mustang escorts. They shot down 11 of our fighters. The room fell silent again. The same pilots, the same German fighters, the same American bombers, Lehmann continued. The only difference was the Mustangs. We'd always been told that American pilots lacked the experience and skill of Luftwaffe pilots. Perhaps that was true once, but their equipment now makes up for any deficiency in training. No one contradicted him. Over the next several days, testing of the captured Mustang continued with increasing intensity. Each pilot who flew it returned with the same mixed expressions of professional admiration and personal concern. The Mustang's exceptional range became even more apparent during fuel consumption tests. It could fly for nearly 8 hours with drop tanks, giving it an operational radius that seemed almost impossible to Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to having barely enough fuel for 2 hours of flight time. On the third day of testing, Schröer found himself walking alongside Dr. Belkov toward the hangars, both men lost in thought. We need to understand how they've achieved this range, Belkov said finally. It's not just fuel capacity. There's something else. The laminar flow wing, Schröer replied. American aeronautical journals discussed theoretical designs before the war. They've actually implemented it. Yes, exactly. Belkov's eyes lit up. The wing creates significantly less drag, but that's not something we can easily retrofit to our existing designs. Could we not copy the Mustang design? Schröer asked. Build our own version. Belkov sighed heavily. Hauptmann, even if we had the industrial capacity, which we increasingly don't, we lack the aluminum alloys they're using. The formulation in the wing spars isn't something we can currently produce in quantity due to shortages of specific metals. And the engine, he shook his head. We'd need to redesign our manufacturing lines completely, which is impossible under current conditions. That afternoon, Sander called Schröer, Meyer and Belkov to his office. A visitor had arrived from Berlin, Oberst Siegfried Knemeyer, head of technical development for the Luftwaffe. Knemeyer was known as one of Göring's favored technical advisors, a brilliant engineer and pilot whose reports went directly to the highest levels of the Reich. Gentlemen, Knemeyer said after cursory introductions. "I understand your evaluation of the American fighter is nearly complete. The Reich Marshal is personally interested in your findings." Sander gestured to Schröer. "Hauptmann Schröer has been our primary test pilot on this project. He can brief you on our observations." For the next 20 minutes, Schröer provided a detailed assessment of the Mustang's capabilities, strengths and weaknesses. Knemeyer listened intently, occasionally making notes, his expression giving away nothing. "And what is your overall conclusion, Hauptmann?" Knemeyer asked finally. Schröer glanced briefly at Sander, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "The P-51 represents a significant threat to our air defense strategy," Schröer said carefully. "Its combination of range, high-altitude performance, and numerical superiority means our fighters will increasingly struggle to prevent American bombers from reaching their targets." "I see," Knemeyer said, his voice neutral. "And you, Dr. Bilko, your technical assessment?" "The aircraft demonstrates the Americans' ability to mass-produce sophisticated weapons with simplified manufacturing techniques," Bilko replied. "From an engineering perspective, it's not revolutionary. It simply combines existing technologies exceptionally well, but their production capacity—" He paused. "We estimate they can replace combat losses at a rate we cannot match." Knemeyer was silent for a long moment. "I will convey your findings to Berlin. Continue your tests. I want a complete technical analysis of every component. If there are weaknesses we can exploit, we need to identify them." He stood to leave, then added, "Your observations remain classified at the highest level. This conversation never happened." After Knemeyer's departure, the mood at Rechlin grew increasingly somber. The implications of what they were learning extended far beyond a single fighter aircraft. The Mustang represented something more profound, evidence of American industrial might translated into combat superiority. On the morning of the 5th day, Meyer took the Mustang up for high-speed tests, pushing the aircraft to its limits. When he returned, his expression was grim as he climbed down from the cockpit. 470 kilometers per hour at 8,000 meters, he reported to Schröer and Belkow. "Sustained speed, not a dive. That's faster than anything we have at that altitude except the Me-262, and that can only fly for minutes, not hours. The FW-190D variant might match it," Schröer suggested. "Perhaps if we can build enough of them before our fuel supplies are completely exhausted," Meyer replied with uncharacteristic bitterness. "Have you seen the latest production figures? The Allied bombing is working, Werner. Our factories are being hit daily." That evening, Schröer sat alone in his quarters, drafting his final evaluation report. The facts were clear enough: speeds, turning radii, climb rates, armament effectiveness. It was the conclusions he struggled with. How could he convey the true significance of what they had discovered without appearing defeatist? How could he be honest about the threat while maintaining the appearance of confidence in ultimate victory? A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Lehmann, the young pilot. "Forgive the intrusion, Herr Hauptmann," Lehmann said, standing stiffly at attention. "I've been reassigned to return to combat duties tomorrow. JG-53 on the Western Front." "At ease, Lehmann. Come in." Schröer gestured to a chair. "So they're sending you back to the fight. How is your arm?" "Fully healed, sir." Lehmann sat down, his posture still rigid. I wanted to ask you something before I leave." "Go ahead." "Is it true what they're saying? That for every Mustang we shoot down, the Americans build 3 more? Schröer considered his response carefully. "The production estimates suggest their replacement rate exceeds ours by a significant margin, yes." Lehmann nodded slowly. "I see. And what would you advise, sir, for those of us returning to combat squadrons?" It was the question Schröer had been avoiding in his report, the human implication of the technical disparity. What advice could he offer to the young pilots who would face these machines in combat, outnumbered and increasingly outperformed? "Vertical tactics," Schröer said finally. "Use the cannon armament to your advantage. A single hit can disable them, while their machine guns require sustained fire. Never engage in extended turning fights above 6,000 meters. Make a single pass, then dive away. Live to fight another day." Lehmann's eyes betrayed his understanding of what wasn't being said, that survival was now the primary objective, not victory. "Thank you." Herr Hauptmann, Lehman said, standing to leave. He hesitated at the door. My brother is 16. He's in the Hitler Youth Flying Program. They tell them they'll be flying jet fighters soon. That German technology will sweep the Allies from our skies. His voice wavered slightly. Should I tell him the truth when I see him on leave? Schröer felt the weight of the question. Tell him to become the best pilot he can be. Skill still matters, Lehman. It always will. After Lehman left, Schröer returned to his report, adding a final section on tactical recommendations for frontline units facing Mustangs in combat. The guidance felt inadequate against the reality they faced, but it was all he could offer. The next morning, the testing program took an unexpected turn. Her telegram arrived from Berlin ordering comparative performance tests. The captured Mustang would fly directly against the latest German fighters in simulated combat scenarios. Pilots from frontline units were being sent to Rechlin to participate, including several high-scoring aces, whose expertise would provide additional validation of the findings. They don't believe our reports, Meyer said as they reviewed the orders. They want to see for themselves. Or they're looking for someone to contradict us, Schröer replied. Someone who will tell Berlin what they want to hear. The first of the combat pilots arrived that afternoon. Hauptmann Erich Hohagen of JG-52, credited with 64 aerial victories, most achieved on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft. Hohagen carried himself with the confident swagger typical of successful fighter pilots, but his eyes betrayed the fatigue of constant combat. So this is the famous Mustang, Hohagen said, walking around the captured fighter. It doesn't look so special. You'll fly against it tomorrow, Schröer told him. Meyer will pilot the Mustang. You'll take up one of our latest Bf-109 G6 models. Hohagen grinned. Excellent. I've shot down 3 of these in actual combat. I'll show you how it's done. The simulated combat flights began early the next day. Meyer took the Mustang up to 8,000 meters, while Hohagen followed in the Messerschmitt. The ground crew watched anxiously as the 2 aircraft circled above the airfield, closing to engagement range. For 20 minutes, the fighters maneuvered against each other in a deadly dance. From the ground, it was difficult to determine which aircraft had the advantage at any given moment. Finally, both landed, taxiing back to the hard stand where Sander and the evaluation team waited. Hohagen jumped down from his cockpit, his expression no longer confident but thoughtful. He walked directly to Meyer, who was just removing his flight helmet. You had me 3 times, Hohagen admitted, his voice low so only Meyer and Schröer could hear. If those had been combat conditions, I'd be dead. You had advantages in the vertical descending maneuvers, Meyer replied. And your roll rate at high speed is superior. But I couldn't sustain energy through extended maneuvers at that altitude, Hohagen said. The Mustang just kept going while my aircraft started bleeding speed. He looked at the American fighter with new respect. And you weren't even flying it at its limits, were you? I've had less than 10 hours in it, Meyer acknowledged. An experienced American pilot would likely extract even better performance. Over the next 3 days, similar comparative flights were conducted with different pilots and aircraft types. The pattern became clear. At higher altitudes, the Mustang held significant advantages over all German piston-engine fighters. Only the Me-262 jet fighter could outperform it, but the jet's limited endurance of less than 30 minutes made it unsuitable as an effective counter to the Mustang's ability to remain in German airspace for hours. On the final day of testing, Schröer took the Mustang up one last time. As he reached 8,000 meters, he pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft accelerate eagerly. Below him, Germany stretched out. Cities, factories, rail yards, all increasingly vulnerable to Allied bombing. He thought about the reports from the front. American bomber formations now regularly protected by swarms of Mustangs, German fighter units suffering devastating losses, trying to breach the escort screen, pilots with thousands of hours of experience being shot down by American aviators with a fraction of their flight time but superior equipment. The problem wasn't just the Mustang itself, impressive though it was. It was what the aircraft represented, America's vast industrial capacity, its ability to produce not just good equipment, but enormous quantities of it. Germany had begun the war with superior tactics and training. The Americans had begun with inferior equipment and inexperienced pilots. Now, not even 4 years later, the balance had shifted dramatically. As Schröer lined up for his final landing approach, a disturbing thought occurred to him. Perhaps the outcome of the air war had already been determined, not by tactics or courage or even skill, but by industrial capacity and access to resources. It was a thought that bordered on defeatism, one he could never express openly. That evening, the evaluation team gathered in Sander's office to finalize their report to Berlin. The mood was solemn as they reviewed their findings one last time. "We must be absolutely clear about the tactical implications," Sander said. "Our fighters can still succeed in individual engagements under the right conditions, but the strategic air battle has fundamentally changed." "The report will not be well received," Belkow noted. "It contradicts the official position that our technological superiority will ultimately prevail." "Nevertheless, it must be accurate," Sander insisted. "Lives depend on it." As they finished the report, Schröer added a personal observation in the final section. "The P-51 Mustang represents not just an excellent fighter aircraft, but the culmination of Allied industrial strategy. Its combination of range, performance, and production capacity means that Allied air superiority over the Reich is likely to increase rather than diminish, regardless of the courage and skill of Luftwaffe pilots." Sander read the paragraph twice, then nodded slowly. "Let it stand. History will judge whether we were honest in our assessment." 2 weeks after completing the Mustang evaluation, Schröer received orders transferring him back to a frontline fighter unit defending the Reich. Before departing Rechlin, he visited the hangar where the captured Mustang was now being systematically disassembled for detailed technical analysis. Engineer Faber was supervising a team removing the wing sections for metallurgical testing. He looked up as Schröer approached. "Returning to combat, Herr Hauptmann?" Faber asked. "Yes. JG-3 on the Western Front." Schröer ran his hand along the Mustang's fuselage one last time. "What will happen to her?" "After complete disassembly and analysis, the components will be sent to various technical institutes for further study," Faber replied. "Though I doubt we'll learn anything truly new at this point." Schröer nodded. "Have you heard anything about our report?" Faber glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Dr. Belkow says Göring refused to forward it to the Führer in its original form. Too pessimistic, apparently. They're rewriting sections to emphasize the Mustang's weaknesses rather than its strengths." "Of course they are," Schröer said quietly. As he walked away from the hangar, Schröer caught sight of a freshly painted Bf-109G model being prepared for delivery to a combat unit. Next to it sat a prototype of the new Ta-152 fighter, Germany's latest attempt to regain air superiority. Both were excellent aircraft, products of superb German engineering. Yet he knew now that excellence alone was insufficient. For every German fighter that reached the front, dozens of Mustangs were rolling off American assembly lines. 2 days later, Schröer arrived at his new posting near Frankfurt. The airbase showed signs of recent bombing, craters filled with gravel, temporary repairs to buildings, and the unmistakable tension of a unit under constant threat. The squadron's aircraft were dispersed and camouflaged around the perimeter, many bearing hasty repair patches. The squadron commander, Major Wilhelm Moritz, welcomed him with the weary handshake of a man carrying too much responsibility. "We've heard about your work at Rechlin," Moritz said. "Your experience with the Mustang will be valuable. We face them daily now." "What are your losses like?" Schröer asked. Moritz's expression darkened. "In the past month, 60% casualties. Replacements arrive with less than 100 hours of flight time. We're lucky if they survive their first 3 missions." He led Schröer toward the operations building. "The Americans send hundreds of bombers, each formation escorted by 50 or more Mustangs. We can barely put 40 aircraft into the air at once, spread across multiple interception points." Inside the ready room, pilots lounged in various states of alertness, some playing cards, others studying maps or writing letters. They were shockingly young, most appearing to be in their late teens or early 20s. Few wore the experience lines that had become common on pilots' faces earlier in the war. "Attention," Moritz called. The room immediately fell silent. "This is Hauptmann Schröer, joining us from the Rechlin Test Center. He's evaluated the Mustang extensively and will brief us on his findings." The pilots gathered around, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled desperation. These were young men who had watched too many comrades fail to return from missions, who faced overwhelming odds daily, yet were still expected to defend the Reich with inadequate resources and dwindling fuel supplies. "The Mustang is not invincible," Schröer began, choosing his words carefully. "It has weaknesses we can exploit. Its turn radius at medium and low altitudes is wider than ours. Its roll rate at high speeds is slower. The armament, while adequate, lacks the immediate stopping power of our cannon." He continued, outlining tactical approaches that offered the best chance of success: vertical attacks, hit-and-run engagements, fighting in pairs to protect each other's vulnerable sectors. The pilots listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed both their intelligence and their awareness of the increasingly desperate situation. After the briefing, a young lieutenant approached Schröer. "Is it true what they say? That for every fighter we lose, the Americans can build 10 more?" The question echoed Lehmann's from weeks earlier. This time Schröer chose a different response. "What matters is not how many aircraft they build, but how effectively we use our," he said. "A superior pilot in an inferior aircraft can still prevail. Focus on becoming that superior pilot." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, but the young lieutenant nodded eagerly, seemingly reassured. Schröer wondered how long this pilot would survive, how long any of them would. That night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar quarters, with the distant thump of anti-aircraft guns firing at Allied reconnaissance aircraft, Schröer found himself thinking about the captured Mustang and what it truly represented. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was the physical embodiment of America's approach to war: practical, mass-produced, surprisingly effective, and overwhelmingly numerous. The next morning brought clear skies, perfect bombing weather. The alert siren sounded just after sunrise. Radar had detected large formations of American bombers crossing the North Sea, heading for targets in central Germany. Within minutes, the squadron was scrambling, pilots running to their aircraft as ground crews completed hasty preparations. Schröer climbed into the cockpit of his assigned Bf-109G, quickly familiarizing himself with this particular aircraft's quirks. As he taxied to the runway, he caught glimpses of the young pilots from the previous day's briefing, their faces set with determination behind oxygen masks and goggles. As his fighter climbed through the crisp morning air toward the approaching bomber stream, Schröer found himself wondering what the American pilots were thinking as they flew into German airspace. Were they confident in their superior equipment? Did they understand the industrial advantage they represented? Or were they simply young men like the ones he had just left on the ground, focused only on surviving their mission and returning home? The German fighters formed up at 7,000 meters, receiving final vector instructions from ground control. Ahead, the first glints of sunlight reflecting off metal became visible, hundreds of flying fortresses and liberators arranged in combat boxes, and surrounding them, the distinctive silhouettes of Mustangs patrolling in pairs and quartets. "Here they come," Moritz's voice crackled over the radio. "Remember your training. Hit and run. Do not get drawn into extended engagements." As Schröer pushed his throttle forward and prepared for the intercept, he thought again of the captured Mustang sitting disassembled in the Rechlin hangar. Its secrets had been revealed too late to change the course of the air war. The knowledge they had gained would inform future German aircraft designs, but the future was rapidly contracting before the onslaught of Allied industrial might. The sky ahead filled with American aircraft, their numbers seemingly impossible against the dwindling strength of the Luftwaffe. Yet Schröer and his fellow pilots pressed forward, driven by duty, and the desperate hope that somehow skill and courage might still prevail against overwhelming odds. In that moment, as the distance closed between opposing forces, Werner Schröer understood the most profound lesson of the captured Mustang. In modern warfare, industrial capacity trumped individual heroism. The Americans had translated their factory production directly into combat power, creating not just a superior fighter, but an insurmountable advantage. It was a lesson Germany had learned too late. As he selected his target and prepared for the attack, Schröer thought of Lehmann's 16-year-old brother in the Hitler youth flying program, still believing in ultimate victory. What would that boy face if the war continued much longer? What future awaited these young pilots climbing into the sky beside him? The first Mustangs turned to meet the German interceptors, the sun glinting off their canopies. The battle was joined, but its outcome, like the larger conflict it represented, had been determined not in the sky but on distant assembly lines and in the strategic calculations of industrial warfare. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.